I'm Jill Tucker, and I'm on the board of the Global Labor Institute. And I'd like to introduce our next very brave speakers, brave because they have the dreaded right after lunch time slot. The first is Angus Bauer. Where are you, Angus? Oh, Angus. Okay. As you can see, Angus is an expert in sustainable investment, and he's been working for the last 3 years as the head of sustainable research at Schroders. How many people know what Schroders is? A few people. So for those who don't, Schroders is an investment management firm that manages close to $1 trillion on behalf of their clients. So we hope, Angus, you're going to invest that wisely. Anyway, the next speaker, you all know Jason. Jason knows many people here and a lot of people in Asia and around the world because he's really been in this field for his entire career. And he's worked at so many reputable and wonderful institutions like the AFL-CIO's Solidarity Center. He's worked for SEIU. He's had a few different stints at the ILO, the Fair Labor Association, and now, of course, Cornell. And Jason is definitely one of the smartest people I've ever met. And what's important is that he's super generous with his knowledge. They're going to present the Higher Ground report. I don't know if you all got the executive summary before you came in or you've seen it before, but I think it's one of the few reports that really goes into a lot of detail on the impact of climate change on workers. And I'm not talking about workers' jobs. We've heard about that, but on workers' bodies, on their health. So without further ado, let's let him take it away.
All right. So what Angus and I thought we would do is share with you the findings, some of the findings. These are two monster reports. And we'll start with a video that we cut when we launched these two reports back in September.
The fashion industry is under threat from climate breakdown. The majority of production is done by workers in some of the world's most climate-vulnerable countries. Our research shows that, in these 4 key producing countries alone, a combination of extreme heat and severe flooding will put over $65 billion of export earnings and around 958,000 jobs at risk by 2030, materially impacting brands and investors. By 2050, these earnings and jobs gaps will increase to 68% and 34% respectively if adaptive measures are not put in place. Together, extreme heat and frequent flooding will cut deeply into workers' productivity and health. They will interrupt production and even close factories. This is what climate loss and damage looks like, and it represents material risks for fashion brands and investors. But not all brands and investors are forecasting these risks into their business plans. To date, fashion's climate strategies have focused on mitigating the impact that production has on the environment. But this approach is no longer sufficient. Brand sourcing in these regions must account for the material risk that climate breakdown brings, and then invest in adaptive strategies to support suppliers and workers. Cooling people and factories on a large scale can help workers and manufacturers claw back some of the losses. In Bangladesh alone, these measures could save up to 73,000 jobs and 28% of lost earnings by 2030. Workers also need relief that allows them to get ahead of soaring food costs and help them to avoid waterborne or heat-related illnesses. This is what a just climate transition looks like. Brands and investors must invest in adaptive strategies and share climate risks and costs to limit the impact that climate breakdown will have on workers.
We, the Cornell Global Labor Institute and Schroders in London, began a conversation about this analysis two Was it 2 years ago? Yikes. We were together, but separately. We were reading industry responses on climate change, and as you just saw, we found that they were chiefly about mitigation, meaning carbon emissions, methane, etc. About greenhouse gas emissions and how to measure them, how to lower them, about energy usage, about water usage, about use of recycled fabrics. And we understood the importance of that, but we knew from work from the work we do, that there was another side to the problem, and that it was climate adaptation, and specifically extreme heat and intense flooding already showing their heads in places where apparel and footwear production is a big thing. In some places, the big thing. We'll talk a lot about Bangladesh in the next hour. So we were both interested in what climate breakdown, as it takes hold, would mean for apparel production, and what are the risks and the costs for workers, yes, but also for their employers and for their governments and their governments' trading partners and brands and investors. And our idea was that we would push all that together into a 20-page report with a couple of graphs. And it's a little longer than 20 pages, but we managed to do that. And the focus, as I said, is on just two of the elements of climate breakdown. There are others, but these are the big ones, or these are the big ones from the apparel production perspective. So first, heat. We're interested in extreme heat. We understand, all of us, its effect on our productivity and our health. And what we did in developing a model, in attempting to measure heat's effect on apparel production, and through them workers, and earnings at the factory level, and earnings at the national level, and impacts on brands, and ultimately investors, was to push together two important measures. One's dry bulb. We call that heat. The other is humidity. Sometimes here we call that a heat index, but in the business, it's called the wet bulb globe temperature. You heard Sarosh refer to it in the last session. And it's this combination of heat and humidity that if you're working in manufacturing, you're working in farming, if you're working almost anywhere where you get heat and humidity combining, you can feel exhausted, you can then dehydrate, you can have a heat stroke, you can die. So we figured, none of us, I should say, well, none of us are climate scientists. None of those working on the report are climate scientists or social geographers. So we had to learn a lot. And one of the things that we learned first was that there are thresholds, there are standards for work in extreme heat. And the ILO has set the bar at about 30.5 or 31 Celsius using this wet bulb globe temperature index. So 31 Celsius dry bulb is not the same as 31 Celsius wet bulb. When we talk about 31 or 32 or 35 under the wet bulb, this heat and humidity measure, it's really hot. So the first thing we did with help from Schroders was to run numbers on key apparel production centers. We wanted to know how many days in the year would each of these centers have a wet bulb globe temperature reading higher than this ILO established threshold. So we took 30.5, 31 as our line, and then we ran the numbers, and you can see them in the table. I've highlighted just four of the places that we focus on in the report. But if you read the report, you'll see that we have 30 plus cities, and that many of them are in the tropical zone that are affected by heat and humidity. So the numbers, Karachi, for example, in 2030, 190 days, 190 exceedance days in the year on which the wet bulb globe temperature reading will be above 31 Celsius. And in Dhaka, the number will be 65 in 2030. In Ho Chi Minh, 55. In Phnom Penh, 41. Those numbers, Karachi aside, those other numbers represent almost a doubling of the number of exceedance days on which that wet bulb globe temp will be above the threshold, a doubling of those days since 2015. So already significantly hotter in these places, or hotter on a significant number of days. And then we pushed it out to 2050 to see what the effect would be 20 years hence. And Karachi comes in at 203 days out of 365. So that's 2/3 of the production year, nearly. Now, these are outdoor temperatures. What's happening inside? Well, the short answer is we don't really know. In the apparel industry and in footwear, there's very little collection of data on heat and almost none on humidity. But we were able to get through the ILO's Better Work program, data from their Cambodia program, which dates how many years, Jill? 20? How?
Cambodia is over 20.
Yeah, so a 20-year program, 20-plus-year program, and still one of only 2 of the ILO Better Work programs in which temperature readings are taken by ILO staff in the factories in the heat of the day during their 2-day assessments. And here's what we found. Here's what they found, rather. Between 2015 and 2022, the percentage of factories, that's represented by the gold bar, the percentage of factories in which the temperature exceeded this 32 Celsius, that's a dry bulb measure, it's only a dry bulb measure, was 70 plus, around 70% for the first 4 or 5 years. You can ignore those 2 COVID years because the way in which it was measured isn't reliable. And then look again at the 2022 figure, you can see that still 54% of factories monitored by the ILO in Cambodia had a heat reading in the middle of the day above 32 Celsius. The dark red bar represents the percentage of factories visited in which the temperature reading was above 32 Celsius, and it was hotter inside the factory than outside. I mean, that stands to reason. You can be in a factory which has 1,500 people and ironing and boiling and lots of machinery and material. So yes, it does get hot inside. But when it's 34 and 35 and 36 and 38 inside a factory, even workers who are acclimatized and accustomed to work in hot environments begin to suffer. So we turned then to with the data, we then turned to the academic literature to try to figure out what it would mean as the wet bulb globe temperature started to creep up according to the projections that we had analyzed. And there's a rough formula that we use to figure out in the analysis how much bite or how much heat takes out of workers' productivity and therefore out of their earnings and factory level earnings and national level earnings. And here it is, above a threshold of 25 a 25 Celsius wet bulb temperature reading. So above 25, for every 1 degree increase, worker productivity in apparel falls off by about 1.5%. So you start stacking this, 25 degrees, 26 degrees, 30, 32, 35, and then you can stack it day on day, and then you can stack all the factories, and you get a picture of the sort of economic damage that high heat and humidity does is doing and will do to the apparel industry. Okay, flooding. So flooding, we break into 2 categories. There's riverine and rainfall flooding, that's one, and coastal, which is sea level rise and storm surge. And in the maps that Schroders produced for us, you're able to see in gold inundation levels. And the darker the color, the higher the flood level, the higher the inundation level. Gold represents sea level rise or storm surge, and red represents rainfall and riverine flooding. These 4 maps are Dhaka, or the Dhaka region, and the blue dots are Tier 1 apparel facilities, apparel and footwear. So you can see in the upper left, that's a 2030 projection in a routine flood event, what we call an RP2, a 2-year flood event. And you can see that sea level rise and storm surge is beginning to impinge on production in the oldest part of the city, the old Dhaka in the bottom of the map. In 2050, you can see that you can see that the inundation levels are significant. That shade of gold represents 0.5 meter and 1 meter and higher. Significant levels of flooding, and now it encroaches on a much larger share of production. Riverine, more dramatic still. Bottom left is Dhaka in 2030, and bottom right is riverine flooding in 2050. So this is what factories are facing. Many of them haven't done neither brands nor employers nor their governments have done analyses like these. But this is likely what's coming their way. We're unable to read at a high level, at the level at which we do this analysis. We're unable to read inundation levels for individual factories in ways that account for flood defenses or ditches, et cetera. So there are ways in which governments, employers, et cetera, can reduce the impact of flooding as they can with heat. And we can't see it in this analysis. So it's not a guarantee that not a guarantee that a factory in the lower right quadrant here will flood at a meter. Could be higher, could be lower. To see how bad it might get, and again, our goal was not to catastrophize. Our goal was not to play up the risk. We used routine flood events, and we used a very middle of the road climate scenario. If you're familiar with the UN process or the climate science, there are 5 possible scenarios, and we picked one right in the middle, 2.45, 2-4.5, which is neither optimistic nor pessimistic, and arguably, increasingly, the most realistic scenario, the one we're facing over the next 20, 30 years. Okay, but we did want to see what would happen if things got really bad. So we ran an analysis with Schroders for 2050 and an RP 100. RP 100 is a 100-year flood event. What would happen to these same factories and the others? So we ran projections for all the major production centers in these 4 countries: Bangladesh, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Vietnam. In Vietnam, this is the Hanoi region, and this is southern Vietnam, the Mekong Delta region. 22% of the extant factories would be inundated at a 0.5 meter or more in that event, in a 2050 100-year event. And the figure for Bangladesh is higher still, 27%. Cambodia and Pakistan, for the risk is considerably lower, but not zero. Okay. So just as with heat, we converted daily factory level losses due to high heat and humidity. We took disruption days, the number of days we expected factories to lose production based on different inundation levels across these 4 countries. And we were able to express them then in dollar terms or export earnings terms, and then we could stack them. So we could come up with the figures that you see in the table here. In 2030, losses, these are losses in export earnings in Bangladesh, will top 27%. And then by 2050, we expect those figures to yawn, or we expect the jaws to widen, and losses, sorry, I meant 27 billion, losses on the order of 711 billion. That's 22% fall off in export earnings for Bangladesh in 2030, and almost a 70% fall off by 2050. And you can see the figures here for the others, but on average across these 4 countries, heat and flood combined, but heat in particular will take a huge bite out of their potential earnings. And you'll see the growth curves for all 4 of these countries begin to bend away. Here's the projected growth if an industry makes investments in adaptation. So cooler buildings, cooler people, flood defenses, et cetera. And the growth curve, if it doesn't make those investments or makes only a few, bends not down, but the slope is radically reduced. We then ran figures for jobs. We were interested both in factory and national industry level earnings fall off, but we were also interested in what might happen to workers and employment levels. So using the figures from the previous table, we were able to calculate a fall off in new jobs. So jobs that would not, foregone jobs that would be created under an adaptive growth scenario versus jobs that would be created under a non-adaptive scenario. And when you add those up for 2050 across those 4 countries, it's 8 million jobs that those 4 countries will go without by 2050 if they fail to make what we call climate adaptive investments. Okay, so there are a couple of things in this analysis that are missing, and if we do more of this, these are other damage functions that we could push in. One is what happens to workers who are ill and are unable to get to work because of illness, or unable to get to work because their neighborhoods are flooded. Another is what happens to critical infrastructure, roads and ports. And we, with Schroders, ran projections for 2030 and 2050 in the major ports, and in Vung Tau, which is one of the major export ports in southern Vietnam. We saw that sea level rise is obviously a problem. It's a problem for any coastal port, but we saw that it would be significant for Vung Tau, and that all the infrastructure behind these floating quays, so docks can rise and fall with tides or storms, but everything behind them, warehouses, rail lines, roads, etc., they don't move. So a major flood event at a port like Vung Tau could shut down production or exports for weeks. We saw it in Durban in 2020, 3 weeks lost. We saw it at ports outside Jakarta, just in the last couple of years. Okay, and the other analysis that we glanced at but didn't dig too deeply into was what's the state of regulation, both public and private? What does the Cambodian government say about high heat? Is there a threshold? Is there a protocol? Well, the short answer is no. You can see in the report the 4 countries. We looked at all manner of standards for heat thresholds, heat protocols, sick leave, force majeure leave, everything that might be connected to high heat and flooding. And with the exception of Vietnam, there's very little to brag about. And then there's the enforcement problem, and enforcement of heat standards across the apparel industry, where it's a problem is woefully weak. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it here, and I'm going to ask Angus to come up and talk about what is largely an investor analysis that you'll find in report 2.
Now, I should say from the off, as Jill said in our introduction, I work in a sustainable investment team. We are clients of Aniket, who spoke earlier from Jefferies. I don't want anyone to be despondent and worried about what Aniket said in terms of investors not caring about metrics. But actually, I have to say, metrics without context are irrelevant to investors. And he is absolutely right. I just wish he had said but at the end of it, because there is an important but. Now, he had to leave, exactly, thank you. But I just wanted to go back to one of the things that Jason mentioned briefly, and there are copies of the work that we've done. It's all far too long, as we have discussed already, but there are copies of it around. On the climate scenarios that we ran, as Jason said, we used a climate model that projects a middle-of-the-road scenario. Now, the actual definition that they use, that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, uses for the scenario that we ran, it goes as follows. The world follows a path in which social, economic, and technological trends do not shift markedly from historical patterns. Development and income growth proceeds unevenly, with some countries making relatively good progress, while others fall short of expectations. Global and national institutions work toward, but make slow progress in achieving sustainable development goals. Now, I bet there's no one in the room that would argue with the reality of that being possibly the most optimistic climate trajectory we are facing today. like Sustainable Development Goals, 1.5-degree targets are challenged. And so, all of the analysis that we're presenting here, we thought when we started this work, this is a reasonable middle of the road. But, realistically, we might be talking about degrees of greater challenge going forward. Now, as Jason said, when we got to the stage where we had delivered the kind of the economic or the macro level picture, and these sort of big consequences for countries like Bangladesh, where apparel exports are so intrinsically important to GDP, that's striking. But our investors invest in companies. Our investors want to understand what these metrics mean, going back to what Annika has already said to this audience today, what these metrics mean to companies and so on. So, logically, we wanted to go through an assessment of the exposure of different brands in the industry, different high street names today. We wanted to understand their exposure to these risks. And so what we did was we picked a cross-section of business models that are reflected in the industry, and we gave them pseudonyms rather than actually naming or calling out any of these companies. And we ran the same analysis that Jason has already been through at the macro level, but this time plotting the locations of the supplier factories for each of the brands using the disclosures that these brands give on the Open Supply Hub. Now, it's a really exciting and like intellectually stimulating thing to do. It's also fraught with error and fraught with assumptions, layered on assumptions. So, we need to be conscious that whilst this industry is like no other in terms of disclosing the locations of supplier factories, can't tell you how many times, and Issa definitely experienced this, how many times we put lat long coordinates from the Open Supply Hub into Google Earth and you find a field and nothing else in that area. So, there is a sort of tolerance level or an accuracy level here that we need to be conscious of. But as you see on the table here, across all of the different types of business model that we were analyzing, that we were trying to understand that the exposure of, there is fairly universal exposure to extreme heat and to extreme flooding. And for some of these companies, by the time we get to the year 2050, which is a very long way out in the context of this industry, is a very long way out in the context of investors thinking particularly, we're talking about meaningful exposures to both extreme heat and flooding. And that, is quite striking when we think about the reality that this industry has grown by externalizing some of the costs associated with production and by outsourcing that production itself. Now, how do I flick on? This is one you really have to squint at, and our maps are very ugly, so I apologize for that. But what we have here is the representation of the different brands under the scenario analysis that Jason has walked through already for the Dhaka region. And there is no one type of brand, or there is no one business model, whether it's online only or mid-market sportswear, in the sample of brands that we analyzed, that is, significantly less at risk if it is present in Dhaka or if it is present in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. These risks are relatively indiscriminate. Now, I should caveat that by saying that with flooding is a localized issue, and you can have different outcomes from one block to the next. And to a degree, this analysis picks that up in the shading that you can see. But when it comes to heat is a much more pervasive and much more all-consuming challenge. And so, this was quite a profound sort of finding for us, that there aren't necessarily particular brands or business models that are less exposed when they're in a given sourcing hub or region. And we also, I should say, ran this analysis for, particularly in Dhaka, for informal facilities. So we weren't able to do this by tagging two brands, because brands don't disclose informal facility relationships on the Open Supply Hub naturally, but you can get the data for those locations. And what we found was that informal facilities are exposed to the same levels of flood-related risk, not statistically speaking any worse, but certainly not any better. And so that was again an important finding that, you know, these issues are universally challenging or likely to become more and more challenging for the industry over time. Now, there is actually something that I dug out of the report, the first report that we published, that I just wanted to share as well, which is that these are projections. These are projections for 2030 and 2050 using the middle of the road climate scenario. But we also did look back in time to see, you know, is it getting any hotter? Just how much hotter is it getting, or is it likely to become than it has been in the past? And, you know, simplistically, we found that days with this wet bulb global temperature of 30.5 degrees or more, they double by the time we get to 2030 relative to the number that they were in 2014. So this is an issue that is becoming incrementally more profound, more potent, more challenging for the industry and all of the stakeholders involved in it. And so the natural question for an investor, as Aniket would say, I don't care about the data if there's no context. The natural question for investors is, well, who pays for this? And actually, what is the financial consequence? You know, when we are investing in companies, we are trying to work out what the discounted value of their future cash flows is. What do we want to pay for this business? And then do we think the stock market is in agreement or disagreement, and therefore do we want to own this company? Do we think this company is going to be a long-term value creator? Naturally, if we think that a company is going to have 20% of its supplier locations underwater, you know, with flood levels up to 75 centimeters for 20 days in the year, we need to think about how to reflect that in our assumptions. And so what we set about doing was really trying to calculate in investment terms, the value at risk associated with these projections. And as Jason spoke to, you know, we used this relationship from a heat perspective of thinking about how much productivity loss is associated with an incremental step up in temperature. We used some quite sophisticated flood damage modeling techniques that were provided by an external Hong Kong-based consultant who helped us on this work to work out when a facility is flooded, you know, how long does it take for the floodwater to recede? How long does it then take to sort of repair that facility before you can start to build production back up again? And, you know, we came to what I would say are estimates. We are in the business of trying to sort of narrow the scope of our estimates a bit, but we still have to always recognize that these are going to be wrong numbers. But we came to the conclusions that for certain brands, we're talking about potential costs, productivity costs associated with it being so hot in a facility that workers have to rest for several hours in the day over the course of a shift because of the intolerable effects of heat, or, you know, the more simplistic effects of flooding, either in villages preventing people from being able to get to factories or factories themselves being flooded. We came to some estimates that suggested for certain brands, you know, there was potentially as much as between 1.5% and 3% of sourcing cost being unearned or walking out the door associated with these productivity headwinds. Now, for an investor, you tell them 1.5% or 3% of procurement costs globally, and they say, well, you know, that doesn't sound too much to me. And then you say, well, yes, but this is a business that has a 50% gross margin, 50% of revenue is spent on procurement, and this is a business that has a 10% profit margin through the cycle. 1.5% to 3% of procurement costs suddenly becomes, you know, 15 to 30% of profit. And that's a big number when we think about the discounted cash flows and the way we want to value these companies going forward. So, you know, actually, when we had these conversations with investors, when we sort of went through this analysis and really sort of started to try and build a picture of the value at risk, the conversation moved away very quickly from, well, who is exposed to, well, what is this going to cost these companies? And what are these companies doing about it? And this is where we were, you know, very fortunate to have been working with Jason and the GLI, because we got the opportunity to you know, not go physically, but to speak to people in the industry, speak to people on the ground, talk to people like Kalpona and so on, to really understand what's happening. And we had one conversation that I will never forget with a long-time procurement individual who, when we gave the numbers to him and we talked about the potential ramifications of these sort of costs, and we then said, and we've spent some time with consultants and designers talking about how companies can invest in adaptation solutions, whether air cooling techniques, not even necessarily the Rolls-Royce of air cooling with an HVAC system, but different types of cooling techniques for heat, for example. We think there are positive ROIs associated with these, i.e. it is almost a no-brainer for you as a brand to work with your supplier to invest in these adaptation solutions. We put this to him and we put the Rolls-Royce solution to them. We said, HVAC, you could go here and you could invest with your brand, you could partner with your suppliers, and you could install HVAC in these facilities, and you could address head-on these issues of extreme heat, and you wouldn't be worse off. In fact, with the productivity gain, the potential productivity gain, you might very well be in a better position. You might also find that your workers or the supplier's workers are in a much healthier state. They're in a much better position as a result as well. This seems like a win-win. What do you reckon? And that individual said to us, well, yeah, the maths make sense. I see your logic. I understand your maps, your scenario analyses, but we can't install aircon. Because if we install air conditioning, the energy intensity, the emissions intensity associated with these facilities goes up. Our Higg index rating will suffer. And this, from an investment perspective, created the most enormous head scratch I think I've had in the last 3 years, because as everyone will probably recognize, the investment industry and government everywhere has focused on mitigation. And it's right that we focus on mitigation in the fashion industry as in other industries, right? Fashion may employ 200-300 million people globally, but it over-indexes in its CO2 emissions contribution. 5 to 10% of global CO2 emissions are generated by the industry. So mitigation should be a focus, but it should not be so much a focus that it disincentivizes investment in adaptation, particularly when that investment in adaptation has economic logic, has cash flow logic behind it. And so that's where we were getting to with this research. And we thought, well, okay, there is something here for investors to go after. There is something here, that context that Aniket is looking for, that sits behind or alongside the metrics, that creates that narrative that can actually be something that we as investors can engage with brands on, that we can work with brands together on to try and identify where there are logical solutions and so on. And so we've started that journey. And what we found very quickly, and I'll zip through this slide fairly quickly, but we started that journey, and we started by talking to the brands about what they've been doing, where they want to go, and how they want to adapt and so on. And I realized there's a very ugly typo on this slide, so maybe we should skip past it. But we found that very few brands are really thinking hard about adaptation. Lots of these companies are reporting TCFD analyses, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Anyone who works in sustainability at brand level will probably know exactly what I'm talking about here. They ask you to present scenario analyses. We are thinking about what happens when the world gets meaningfully hotter and what we have to do, and how that affects our profit and loss account, how that affects our balance sheets. And they think about the reporting and the conversations we've had with brands focus on the scenario analyses and the effects on owned real estate. And they focus on the consequences of extreme heat and flooding that are felt at the very top of the supply chain, in cotton farming, at the raw material level. But there is very little, or in our experience, in the conversations we've had and the analysis we've done so far, there has been very little of substance that has yet started to address this sort of midpoint in the supply chain, where the manufacturing exists, where the people, where literally, as Jason has alluded to, millions of people are employed, and where you are at a sort of bottleneck in terms of the financial consequences of addressing or failing to address these issues. So that's really where we have gone so far in the work. That's what's contained in the second report. And hopefully, if Aniket were here, I mean, we've discussed this at length actually, but hopefully, if he were here, he would he would agree that the next step really, because metrics are important, context and the value, the how does this affect the valuation of these companies is important. That's the sort of cash related work that we've been doing. The next step is then, what is the tolerance level for a brand? So to our sourcing directors, how bad does it have to get before you do want to move? How if you're thinking about inflation that you're looking to offset year after year because of wages, how much more painful do things have to get before you think about change, before you think about adaptation and so on? Because again, we want to invest in the companies that can create value and create value sustainably that endures. That's what sustainable investing is about. And really that's where we're trying to sort of move this work in terms of direction. So, the final thing we came up with is a selection of recommendations. We didn't want to throw the proverbial book out there in terms of like really beat the drum too aggressively. So we think we've set out some reasonable requests or expectations of stakeholders here. And certainly from my perspective, representing the investor community here, there is a need to do this sort of modeling. There is a need to gather this sort of data, think about the context, and then engage with companies. It's not about saying, hey, we think you're super exposed, so we don't want anything to do with you. It's a conversation to have where you say, hey, here's what we found. Here's the exposure. Here's how we think this could be affecting you. What do you think? What are you doing about this? How are you going to change your capital allocation? How are you going to think about where you source from and how you work with your suppliers? Because at the end of the day, investment is about capital allocation. And what we want to do is we want to understand how the brands and the other actors in the supply chain are thinking about these topics. Jason.
Okay, just three more recommendations, then we're gonna move on. First is that this is for both public regulation and private regulation, but the emphasis is on public at the national level, at the trade partner level. Start treating climate events and its impact for workers as health hazards, and that means writing into national law temperature standards and protocols. It means changes in work hours. It means ensuring that workers who are ill due to climate impacts are getting paid. There's a whole suite of things, and you'll find them described in the report. The second is running numbers on the sorts of modest adaptation investments that employers and their governments and brands can make now to start cooling buildings and cooling people and reducing flood risk. There's a little of that in the report, but there's probably a lot more to come. The thing to understand is that the ROI is positive, that these are modest investments. And the last thing is that we have to keep our eye on the social, even as we get drawn into the wonky, exciting investments in the physical. So a new factory with active and passive cooling technologies and blah 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 blah. I mean, there's a lot. Well, you find all that in the paper. What we have to keep our eye on is the most important adaptive investment of all, which is investments in workers and their families. Because no policy, no high-level investment is going to help these families stay ahead of the climate crisis curve. It doesn't. These programs don't allow families to afford food as the prices leap. It doesn't allow them to pay an electricity bill as it doubles and triples in the hottest months. It doesn't cover their medical bills when they climb 10x. That's what we heard from workers in Dhaka. In the hottest and wettest months of the year, their medical costs go up 10 times. So lashing together the social and the physical as these governments and employers and others go after just transition money that could pay for exactly the sort of investments that we're talking about.